Hi guys, I believe a big problem for Labour in Scotland is the issue of Brexit. Of course, the vast majority of Labour supporters there voted to remain, but since Keir Starmer has taken on the idea of making Brexit work and refusing to discuss the idea of rejoining the EU and eventually bringing back freedom of movement, it puts Scottish Labour in a bit of a fix. Here Jackie Baillie, the deputy leader, tried to blame the SNP government and Health Secretary Hamza Yousaf in particular for the problems facing the NHS. But the BBC, yes, the BBC, pushed back and mentioned Brexit too. Have a listen to this.
His eye is not on the ball, and particularly not just now during a leadership contest, but we need people who are entirely focused on trying to avert the crisis in the NHS. That starts by listening to the clinicians, but we also need a credible workforce plan that's been absent for the past 15 years. We're simply not training enough doctors or nurses. There are 6,300 nurse vacancies at the moment, 1,000 GPs short. That has an impact.
Though. Sir Keir Starmer spoke about this, and he was saying that the UK was recruiting too many people from overseas, that immigration wasn't the solution. The SNP would argue that it would be, that actually Brexit has made the workforce issue much worse. So who's right there?
The reality is you are not going to solve the recruitment crisis by simply recruiting people from overseas. We need more Scottish...
But it would help, would it not? Especially in the
Of course it would help, but it's a short-term sticking plaster.
What are you talking about? Countries around the world have relied on foreign staff for decades. The UK used to rely on foreign staff. It still does. This is not a short-term sticking plaster to bring in staff from abroad. This has been policy for decades. What is she talking about? Now, of course, she has to defend whatever Keir Starmer has said, even if it goes against the interests of Scotland.
We need to actually train more doctors and nurses that are domiciled in Scotland, that are likely to stay in Scotland. We also need to urgently retain the staff that we have. People are leaving because they're burnt out, they're exhausted. We need to care for those who are caring for us in order to have them stay within the NHS, because there is no short-term sticking plaster solution to this. You know, I see so many people using the private sector. That is the ultimate sticking plaster. It's not a solution.
It's not a solution. But the problem Scotland faces is that it has a limited budget. So it has a limited budget when it comes to money received from Westminster. As the Scottish Government can raise some taxes, but not in the same way that Westminster can. So what you're asking the Health Secretary here to do is to spend more money on retaining staff and more money on training. Well, where is that money going to come from? Because if Scotland has a limited budget, pretty much a limited budget, it has to cut spending somewhere else. So where are you suggesting it cuts spending in order to retain staff? Because in other countries, they say, okay, we need to retain staff, we need to train up staff, we need to spend money to do this. Well, what we can do is we can raise taxes. The Scottish Government is limited in what it can do there. Or we can borrow money, and the Scottish Government is limited in that scope too. So what it needs to do is it needs to raise some taxes somewhere. I don't know if that's going to be enough to cover these costs, or cut the budget somewhere else. And if they cut the budget somewhere else, you're going to complain about that too. And of course, the problem also is that if Scotland doesn't have the staff it needs, it has to recruit them from somewhere. And if it can't bring staff in from abroad because immigration is a reserved matter, it's the job of Westminster. The Scottish Government doesn't have control over immigration, so it can't, change the visa system and bring in more staff. Its hands are tied there, which she knows. So what does it do? It has to rely on the private sector, which is more expensive. Bringing in staff from the private sector is much more expensive than keeping the staff that you have, or training or bringing in staff into the public sector. So if you're relying on the private sector, that's eating in also to the NHS budget. And then there's also the issue of inflation. So, Scotland's hands are tied in two ways. First, when it comes to recruiting staff from abroad, it doesn't have control over immigration. And also its ability to raise taxes, increase revenue, to borrow money, is extremely limited because it's a devolved administration and not an independent country. She knows this, but she can't admit that Brexit has been a disaster and Brexit is the wrong way to approach this. And instead she's saying, well, we shouldn't rely on sticking plasters or short-term solutions when this has been part and parcel of NHS policy for decades. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.